In the Nazi Bible, Mein Kampf, Hitler has nothing but good to say of his friend Rudolf Hess. He even appointed him deputy Führer and leader of the Nazi Party.
According to a statement released by the Allies in West Berlin, Hess died while still inside the city's giant red brick Spandau prison.
A dead Nazi, a lonely prison, and a story buried for decades, until now. In 2025, stunning revelations finally cracked open one of World War II's darkest and most perplexing secrets. The true story behind Rudolf Hess's mysterious solo flight to Britain and his even more suspicious death decades later. What if the whole thing was staged and he didn't really end himself? What if Britain knew more than it ever admitted? If you've ever wondered how deep the rabbit hole of Nazi espionage, royal involvement, and Cold War secrecy goes, this is your deep dive. The flight that shouldn't have happened, May 10, 1941. The world was at war, but one man, seemingly disconnected from all logic, prepared for an act so bizarre it left even Adolf Hitler speechless. Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer of Nazi Germany, second only to Hitler himself in political standing, boarded a twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf 110 and flew solo from Germany to Scotland. He wasn't defecting. He wasn't fleeing. He claimed he was on a secret mission for peace. What made this flight so disturbing was how methodical it was. This wasn't a sudden psychotic break or an act of desperation. It was a calculated mission, one he had spent months preparing. Starting in late 1940, Hess underwent intensive flight training in secret. He wasn't just brushing up on old skills. He was training specifically on the aircraft he would later fly across enemy territory. He even had the plane modified. Special long-range fuel tanks were added, and a radio compass was installed to help him navigate across the North Sea. This wasn't fantasy. It was logistics. His destination? Scotland. Specifically, Dungavel House, the estate of the Duke of Hamilton. Hess had been convinced that Hamilton, an RAF officer and British aristocrat, could help broker peace between Germany and Britain. It wasn't a random theory. Hess's academic mentor, Professor Karl Haushofer, had personal connections with the British elite, including Hamilton, whom he had met during the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Hess believed these contacts represented a faction in Britain, within the aristocracy, and even possibly the royal family, who wanted to end the war with Germany and contain Stalin instead. But there was a problem. The British government already knew Hess was planning something. In September 1940, British intelligence intercepted a strange letter Hess had attempted to send to the Duke of Hamilton, outlining vague intentions of peace and diplomacy. MI5 reportedly flagged it and passed it through the appropriate channels. And yet, months later, no increased defense posture was taken in Scotland. Nothing seemed out of place when Hess finally took off. Why not? That flight was itself a bit unsavory. Hess took off from the Augsburg-Hounstetten airfield just before 6 o'clock in the evening, heading north over Denmark and then turning west across the North Sea. British radar began picking him up immediately and promptly tagged him hostile. With the Spitfires on scrambling orders to intercept, Hess flew at low level to avoid them. Indeed, by the time he reached Scotland, he had been visually signed off by folk on the radar monitor and civilian observers, but somehow not shot down. Some accounts even suggest that his plane was given a corridor, an unconfirmed claim, but one that came under the spotlight and gained traction in the 2025 alerts. For sure, Hess bailed out of the aircraft fuel-deprived. He landed at Flores Farm, just outside Glasgow, and coolly identified himself as Captain Alfred Horn to the dumbfounded local farmer who found him there. But even then, Hess repeated a very strange demand. "Take me to the Duke of Hamilton. I have an important message." There was no interrogation in the wilderness. He was very carefully moved, quietly from police custody to military detention barracks and to secret meetings with the very man named by him in his plan. And during the first 48 hours, no news made it to the public. Discretion like this, for such a high-ranking Nazi, was something astonishing indeed. This raises a haunting question. If Hess's peace mission was nothing but a rogue, delusional fantasy, why was he treated like a diplomat, not a prisoner of war? Something was fishy about that flight. Weirder still was the aftermath of Hess's capture, with Churchill's reaction, who he met, and what he divulged. And Churchill's next move would expose more than just a Nazi secret. It would uncover a diplomatic panic at the heart of Britain's war strategy. Churchill's silent panic. When news of Rudolf Hess's unexpected arrival in Scotland reached Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the initial reaction wasn't what you'd expect from a wartime leader informed that Hitler's second-in-command had parachuted into British territory. There was no media statement, no military show of force, no propaganda celebration. Instead, Churchill moved fast and in complete silence. Within hours, Hess was under heavy but discreet guard. He was not paraded as a captured enemy. Instead, he was moved to a series of controlled locations, beginning with Maryhill Barracks in Glasgow and later to Buchanan Castle, where his initial debriefings took place. During these transfers, he was still treated as a guest more than a prisoner. The tone was careful, cautious, and unsettling. The Duke of Hamilton, the very man Hess had requested by name, personally met with him in private. According to official accounts, Hess revealed his true identity and explained that he had come on a peace mission directly authorized by Hitler. This is where things get murky, because while Hitler's recorded outbursts suggest he was furious and blindsided by Hess's flight, the way British officials responded hints at a different understanding. Churchill was briefed by the Duke of Hamilton shortly after that meeting. He then convened a highly secret session with members of his war cabinet at Ditchley Park. No transcripts were released, no minutes were made public. What little we know comes from second-hand reports, and from a quiet but undeniable tightening of internal communications that followed. Here's where it gets even more suspicious. Major Frank Foley, one of MI6's top intelligence officers and a seasoned interrogator, was assigned to Hess. Foley had worked extensively with Nazi informants before the war and was considered an expert on German internal politics. He interviewed Hess over a full year. Yet almost all of Foley's reports were sealed, until they were partially referenced in a 2025 Freedom of Information leak. They had not treated Hess as a lunatic, said the documents. They listened. Hess claimed to have the endorsement of Hitler for a peace negotiation, one wherein Britain would be offered complete dominion over its empire in exchange for German liberation in continental Europe. Churchill did not accept the offer, but neither did he dismiss Hess outright. The immediate dismissal approach of Churchill and his top advisors appears untenable in light of their actual conduct. Meetings were dragged on. Security was intense. Hess was not placed in an asylum ward, but kept under the comfortable care of Mayndiff Court Hospital, under military supervision and not medical. There was censorship, too. The British public would not even know of Hess's arrival until much later. When news did come, it was brief and vague, lost amid other wartime events on a fast track to oblivion. There were no photos, no quotes from him, no trial, no clear and credible explanation of what he said. Churchill was trapped. A public trial might expose uncomfortable truths, but silence was dangerous too. So instead, he kept Hess hidden, labeling him unstable while extracting every ounce of intelligence possible behind closed doors. But Churchill wasn't the only one watching closely. Across Europe, another group feared what Hess might reveal, and they had the motive and reach to keep him quiet. And that fear leads us straight into the halls of royalty and the secrets that could have toppled dynasties. The royal family's secret connections. If Rudolf Hess believed he could negotiate peace with Britain through aristocratic back channels, he wasn't pulling that idea out of thin air. He was operating on whispers, connections, and pre-war sympathies that were very real and very dangerous for the British establishment. To understand the risk Hess posed, you have to go back to the 1930s. Several prominent British nobles had expressed support or sympathy for fascism, some openly, others in private salons and exclusive clubs. At the heart of this was Edward VIII, who abdicated the throne in 1936 and became the Duke of Windsor. He had visited Hitler. He had been photographed giving the Nazi salute. MI5 files, some now declassified, confirmed that he was considered a potential security threat during the war. But Edward wasn't the only concern. In 1936, Professor Karl Haushofer, mentor to both Hess and Hitler, met the Duke of Hamilton during the Berlin Olympics. That meeting would leave a lasting impression on Hess. Haushofer returned to Germany believing Hamilton was sympathetic to their worldview or, at the very least, open to diplomacy. Hess never let go of that belief. So when he parachuted into Scotland 5 years later, it wasn't random. It was a direct attempt to tap into those old aristocratic connections that were thought to exist behind Churchill's hard exterior. What's most chilling is that some members of the British elite did, in fact, advocate for peace with Nazi Germany, if only to avoid war with the Soviet Union. A theory was quietly spreading among conservatives, imperialists, and anti-communists that Germany and Britain should be allies, not enemies. Hess, as bizarre as his mission sounds today, was trying to trigger that alliance. Now, new documents that have come to light in 2025 provide a shocking backdrop to the events of 1940. Declassified Foreign Office memos released by investigative historians today contain coded references to contingency channels and non-government intermediaries operating in 1940. Among those intermediaries was one tied to aristocratic families, including one name that has sent shockwaves through the public: Mountbatten. But the documents won't go so far as to connect the royal family to negotiations with Nazi Germany. Nevertheless, the documents show concern at the highest levels about what Hess might come out and say under interrogation. His knowledge of who spoke with whom before the war, especially in backdoor settings, could have decimated reputations and political careers. They even came up with a contingency for moving Hess offshore, in case he would be under heightened public scrutiny. This plan was never activated, but its existence indicates just how seriously the whole affair was taken. And Hess wasn't making it easy for them either. During his early interrogations, he hinted that he had been in conversation with men close to the crown. No names were mentioned supporting his implication, but it referred to something big. For a monarchy already pressed by wartime circumstances, the suggestion that one of their own might have been indulging possible peace contacts with Nazi Germany was political dynamite. But what if his madness wasn't the cause? It was the result of manipulation, isolation, and substances. Because the next phase of Hess's life didn't play out in a courtroom. It played out in psychiatric wards, military hospitals, and secret files, and it left behind one burning question. Was Rudolf Hess driven insane? Or was he silenced one dose at a time? The psychological breakdown. Shortly after Rudolf Hess's capture, the British government began carefully shaping the public narrative. Hess was mentally unstable, a deluded man operating without Hitler's approval, and ultimately harmless. It was a message designed to calm public fears and, more importantly, to distance the British establishment from any implications of secret diplomacy. But behind closed doors, Hess's condition and treatment became something far more disturbing. He was first examined by two British psychiatrists, Dr. Henry Dix and Dr. John Rawlings Rees, both of whom concluded that Hess was suffering from paranoid delusions and possible amnesia. They said he exhibited signs of extreme hypochondria and episodes of confusion. At face value, it seemed plausible. Hess had, after all, made a solo flight into enemy territory during wartime. But something didn't sit right. Despite being labeled unstable, Hess remained in military custody, not a psychiatric institution. He was housed at Main Diff Court Hospital under tight security, treated politely, and given access to correspondence and books. His interrogators, including MI6 officer Major Frank Foley, met with him regularly, not to assess his mental state but to extract intelligence. Hess was cooperative at first, but over time, his statements grew more erratic. He began to claim he was being poisoned. He insisted that Churchill and the British government were under a kind of mind control. Specifically, that a secret force was influencing them, a force he said was controlled by international Jews. At the time, these statements were dismissed as proof of his insanity. But documents declassified in 2025 revealed a more troubling possibility. Hess's own medical logs, preserved in a now digitized RAF archive, included notes about frequent injections administered by military doctors, without clear justification. The contents of those injections were never disclosed, but one leaked report references experimental sedatives tested under wartime exemptions. Was Hess being medicated into incoherence? It's a grim theory, but it aligns with his increasing mental instability, episodes that began only after several weeks in British custody. In June 1942, barely more than a year after he had set foot in the new surroundings, Hess tried to escape life by hurling himself down a flight of stairs. He survived, but with an injury that badly damaged his leg. He thereupon got more and more erratic in behavior. He claimed amnesia, forgot important points, grew morbidly obsessed with his inner organs and bodily functions, convinced that he was being poisoned gradually. Churchill allegedly visited him in the company of the Lord Chancellor in June 1942 to have a meeting during which Hess once again repeated his plea for peace terms very much like those offered by Hitler through neutral intermediaries. Allow Germany free total control of continental Europe, then Britain would keep its empire. But the offer's timing is significant. By the middle of the year, things were beginning to look a little iffy for Hitler as far as invading Russia went. England was on its feet again. The Americans were inching closer to war, none of which was in Britain's interest for a negotiated peace, and Churchill knew as much. Thus, from then on, Hess was a liability. The British position is firming. Hess could no longer be considered an informer. By the end of the war, he had been moved out of view into a hospital in Wales. Although the media would occasionally refer to him, the man was more or less erased. But why keep him locked away for decades if he were truly mad? Why, from such interviews as he held, hoard their documents and the conducted meetings? The answer, as the 2025 revelations will suggest, is that his madness, in fact, may not have been entirely his own. It may have been manufactured, or at the very least, manipulated. Because the war ended, but Hess's captivity didn't. And as the world moved on, he became the sole prisoner in a fortress designed for hundreds, watched by armies, visited by no one. And what happened in that prison would only deepen the mystery and hint that death may not have come by choice. The prison that held a ghost. By 1966, Spandau prison in West Berlin was one of the strangest places on Earth. Originally built to hold hundreds of inmates, it now had just one, Rudolf Hess. Every other high-ranking Nazi convicted at the Nuremberg trials had either served their time and been released or died in custody. But Hess remained alone, aging, and under constant surveillance by rotating teams from the Allied powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. 40 guards for one man. That was the arrangement. A rotating monthly schedule ensured that no single country had long-term control. The prison became a Cold War symbol, both sides keeping the last public Nazi under lock and key, more as a political statement than a security necessity. Hess had become, quite literally, a ghost in a castle. But why keep him there? Why not release him? As had been done with others like Albert Speer. After all, Hess had been sentenced for crimes against peace, not genocide. He had no involvement in the Holocaust. He wasn't a military leader. He had flown to Britain in 1941, long before many of the worst Nazi crimes were even planned. Here's where the story turns chilling. According to several former guards and civilian staff who worked at Spandau, Hess was treated with a strange mix of strictness and sympathy. His cell door was often left open due to his deteriorating health. He was allowed to garden, read, and even write letters to his family, but he was never left alone, not even for a moment. A nurse, a guard, or a warder was always nearby. Over the decades, rumors began to swirl that the man inside Spandau wasn't Hess at all. Some claimed that the real Hess had died shortly after his capture and was replaced by a double. The theory seemed outlandish, until forensic specialists in the late 1980s and again in the 2000s pointed out inconsistencies in medical records. Hess had reportedly suffered a chest wound during World War I, one that left a lasting scar. But British doctors who examined him during his early years in custody made no mention of it. In 2025, newly published papers and testimonies laid fire to this theory. A posthumous memoir revealed that there were serious doubts raised internally in MI6 about Hess's identity as early as 1943, said a retired British intelligence officer. The Soviets, too, are reported to have expressed doubt as to whether the man in Spandau was the real deputy Führer or merely a convenient stand-in to mask an early wartime execution or end one's own life. Whether or not the body double holds water, one fact is indisputable. By the 1980s, continued imprisonment served neither legal nor moral purpose. He was 93, frail, and had difficulty lifting his own arms. He posed no threat. Yet, that confinement remained total. Visitations were few and far between. His son, Wolf Rüdiger Hess, was one of the select few permitted sporadic access. And Wolf never accepted the official version of things. He believed his father was held not in justice, but in silence. Releasing those names could cause reputational harm even decades thereafter. So Hess had been placed under round-the-clock observation, even in his last days. But under that very supervision, something went terribly amiss, or perhaps according to plan. Because in August 1987, the world was told that Rudolf Hess had ended his life. The problem? Almost no one who knew him believed it. And what the guards saw that day would raise more questions than it answered. The death no one believed. On August 17, 1987, the last Nazi leader imprisoned after World War II was found dead in the small garden house inside Spandau prison. The official story claimed Rudolf Hess, aged 93, frail, arthritic, and nearly blind, had taken his own life by hanging himself with an electrical extension cord. But almost immediately, something felt off. The death scene raised red flags. Hess was supposedly found hanging by a thin cord inside a garden shed with windows and a door that could easily be seen from the guards' posts. According to the official report, the elderly Hess had somehow managed to lift a heavy extension cord over a window latch and hang himself while unattended, despite strict regulations requiring constant observation. Within hours, military pathologists performed an autopsy. The cause of death: asphyxiation. But this ruling did little to calm growing suspicion. For starters, Hess's physical condition made ending his own life seem almost impossible. Multiple independent medical reports had documented his declining strength, poor coordination, and difficulty lifting his arms. His family, especially his son Wolf Rüdiger Hess, immediately called foul. Wolf, who had visited his father just days earlier, said he had found him weak but mentally alert, and, more importantly, determined to continue his legal battle for release. He even said that his father told him, "They're going to slay me." Wolf wasn't alone in his doubts. Nurses and prison staff interviewed later claimed that Hess had shown no signs of suicidal behavior. In fact, one of the civilian warders who was present at the prison that day told investigators that he saw unfamiliar personnel near the garden house, men who had not been part of the regular rotation. Then came the Soviets. One Soviet report, later uncovered through diplomatic archives in 2025, alleged that the scene had been disturbed before Soviet officers were allowed to examine it. They questioned how a prisoner under four-nation guard, monitored 24/7, could have ended his life unnoticed. The theory that Hess had been slain wasn't new, but until 2025, it remained confined to whispers, fringe historians, and the protestations of his family. Then came the leak. In March 2025, an MI6 document, classified of course, was anonymously uploaded to a historical forum using encryption. Although it took weeks to debate its authenticity, a forensic linguistics analysis and metadata tracing did confirm it as a bona fide document. The memo discusses potential serious political hazards in regard to Hess being freed because of potentially damaging disclosures to Britain's wartime diplomacy in 1987. The spookiest line read ultimately, "Containment must be absolute. Exposure cannot be permitted at this stage." The phrasing here was ambiguous, but it was really sharp in what it suggested. It implied that certain British intelligence members believed that such a release would unleash a scandal, the very sort of scandal that would involve historical truths never brought to light. Was it enough to justify slaying? There was one key detail that caught the attention in this memo, dated 2025. It included a redacted name, probably referring to a high-placed British diplomat associated with unauthorized negotiation with Nazi officials in 1940. The document revealing this was concerned that Hess could confirm that the meeting indeed took place. And worse, it involved more than one of the ruling class in Britain. The demise of Hess effectively quenched that threat. The four Allied countries presented a joint statement claiming that taking his own life was an act of desperation from a man who saw no future prospects. Even then, the Soviet Union had refused to sign the Opiate Convention and accused the West of foul play. Just the same, with the documents of 2025 now in public domain, historians and legal experts are demanding reclassification. Consider how witness inconsistencies, combinations of physical impossibility and intelligence leaks, have transformed a footnote in history into a full-blown scandal. Some are even calling for a formal inquest, arguing that what was once dismissed as conspiracy theory now stands on a foundation of authenticated evidence. And as investigators combed through decades of sealed evidence, what they found next didn't just rewrite Hess's story. It rewrote the story of Britain's involvement in World War II. Because once the hidden memos were opened, there was no putting this ghost back in the vault. The 2025 documents that changed everything. It began with a leak. An anonymous upload to a password-protected archive used by military historians revealed a single redacted memo marked Black Garden, Eyes Only. It was dated February 1940 and came from the Foreign Office. What followed over the next several weeks in 2025 was a cascade of once-buried documents that would finally blow open the truth about Rudolf Hess, his strange flight to Britain, and why he was silenced. Historians and journalists had long speculated that Britain had back-channel contacts with Nazi Germany in the early stages of the war, especially before Winston Churchill took over from Neville Chamberlain. What the Black Garden file confirmed was that there had been at least one unauthorized meeting between British aristocrats and intermediaries for Hitler's regime. It took place in Portugal, a neutral country, and the topic was clear: peace in exchange for empire. According to the document, the offer was consistent with what Hess later proposed. Britain would retain its global holdings, while Germany would be given a free hand in continental Europe. Most chilling of all, the file included names. Although some were redacted, enough slipped through to reveal the presence of figures closely connected to both Parliament and the royal household. Hess wasn't imagining contacts with the British elite. He had detailed, documented knowledge of conversations that officially never happened. And this is what changed everything. For decades, the narrative around Hess had been shaped by two things: silence and ridicule. The British government cast him as unstable. His prolonged imprisonment was painted as a form of justice. His death, a sad but expected conclusion to a lonely life. But these documents flipped the entire story. Suddenly, the idea that Hess was silenced, not because of his madness, but because of what he knew, seemed not only plausible, but probable. One of the worst files ever released in 2025 was an internal MI6 communication, dated 2 days after Hess arrives in Scotland. The senior officer there described him as lucid, detailed, and thoroughly informed on British political channels. Other lines of this document mentioned that Hess correctly identified a conversation that had taken place in April 1939 involving a House of Lords member and a German liaison. That conversation had never been acknowledged by the government. The overall load of the newly released material, great and increasing. Memos were showing some anxiety in Churchill's circle. Several plans were drafted for Hess: deportation to Canada, transfer to an undisclosed psychiatric facility, or a closed tribunal. They did none of these. Instead, they went for indefinite and quiet containment. Even more fascinating was the remarkable synchronism or timing. Each time there were acute ups or downs in the war, whether in the North African campaign or the preparations for D-Day or the early tensions of the Cold War, Hess was subjected to further isolation from the outside world. It wasn't what he had done, but what he might very well say. Hess had outlived his usefulness by then, by the arrival of the year 1987. The Cold War was changing, the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapsing, and with surfaces of sensitive wartime secrets being so high during the détente talks, the newly unearthed 1987 directive kicked AMSID for eyes-only Permanent Security Council members had intended, Subject A7 must not be released under any circumstances. Active operational containment protocol now. And just like that, history changed. Not because of innocence, he was not innocent. He was a very high-ranking Nazi and an early architect of the regime. But the reality about his escape, his knowledge, and the decades-long isolation was darker than anyone had guessed. What is clear is the extent to which the intelligence services across nations cooperated to suppress the Hess matter, conspicuously long after the end of the war. A briefing by CIA analysts in 2025, dated 1958, indicates that American analysts were instructed to ensure narrative cohesion with British accounts about Hess's mental state and imprisonment. Records from France and even West Germany alluded to similar pressures. Communiques using the term operational alignment for geopolitical stability abound. In other words, post-war stability overshadowed historical truth, and Rudolf Hess was a casualty. If this story gave you chills, hit like and share it with someone who still thinks the history books got it all right. Subscribe for more unsolved war secrets, hidden files, and declassified truth bombs. And don't miss our next video popping up on your screen. It's another chapter they never wanted you to read. History isn't finished. It's just been heavily edited.